こんにちは。Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to listen to Tunes of the Kingdom, our presentation about the Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. This is a Hylian shield. It should be familiar to fans who have been playing the Legend of Zelda series for a long time. But I doubt anyone imagined that you would be able to attach a piece of icy meat to it and use it to surf at high speed in the latest game in the series. This is a sequel to the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, so you may have guessed there would be a portable cooking pot. But I doubt anyone predicted the cooking pot would also have excellent suspension. Even we didn't predict that. No matter how difficult the situation, sometimes you can just stick a bunch of logs together and figure something out. Rather than using only wisdom to find a solution, sometimes it is just as important to have a courage to power through a problem. Hello, everyone. I am Takuhiro Dohta. I joined Nintendo in 2003. I've been involved in many titles, working on game programming, developing game engines, and prototyping new games from a technological perspective. I was the technical director for both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. As you just saw, we introduced the ability to stick objects together as a distinctive game mechanic in Tears of the Kingdom. We wanted to let players combine objects to make new discoveries and try unexpected methods. To start off, let me provide some background about how the idea of sticking objects together came about in Tears of the Kingdom. First, let's return to the topic of Breath of the Wild. We had two major themes during development of Breath of the Wild. The first was a fast and seamless Hyrule. In Breath of the Wild, we wanted players to see a place in the distance and be able to reach it simply going in that direction. But at the same time, simply making the game feel fast and seamless doesn't necessarily make the game itself fun. So we came up with the idea of multiplicative gameplay. This was the second theme. Now then, what does that mean? Multiplicative gameplay is a game structure that lets players combine actions and objects to create many different ways to play. This was one of the themes of our Breath of the Wild presentation for GDC 2017. This is a slide from that time. All objects in the game are connected by same world rules, such as physics and chemistry. This allows actions and objects and the game field to interact on a low basis. These interactions cause many different things to happen automatically, such as falling boulders, damaging enemies. And game designers use these rules as a basis for level design. Rather than creating something fun, create a system that makes fun things happen. This is a concept behind multiplicative gameplay. We wanted to take the two development themes that were realized in Breath of the Wild and expand on them even further for Tears of the Kingdom. First, we decided to expand Hyrule, and the scope of players' adventure. After developing Skyward Sword, we wanted to try seamlessly connecting the sky and surface in the future title. There have been many examples of a dark world that is a counterpart of the surface in the series. In this game, we created the depths based on this concept. Our producer wanted to dig holes in the world ever since development of Breath of the Wild started. So we dug holes. We expanded the world of Hyrule more and more, going upwards, downwards, and even inside. But let me repeat, simply making the game feel vast doesn't necessarily make the game fun. How should players get around in the sky? What kind of gameplay should exist in the depths? We wanted to enhance the multiplicative gameplay too. But how are we going to do that? By the way, this is an article that was published on the Japanese Nintendo homepage after Breath of the Wild was released. These octoballoons were special materials, even in Breath of the Wild. They can make an object float when attached to it. We implemented this functionality not to be used as a solution, but as a way to make the multiplicative gameplay even more plentiful. Because of this, it wasn't a major element, but we actually felt that the ability to stick one object to another had a lot of potential. So, when development began on Tears of the Kingdom, Mr. Fujibayashi, the game's director, produced the prototypes like these. These were made in Breath of the Wild's game engine by forcefully sticking objects that appear in the game together. By combining objects, he created something new. By the way, the wheels are actually cogwheels that Mr. Fujibayashi stole from the dungeon. So we began proper prototyping to stick objects together freely. The potential of sticking objects together that we felt with the octoballoons and the new value gained by combining objects shown by the prototypes. We felt that this could be a gameplay point for this expanded world. In the end, Ultra Hand and Fuse were born. What was once a simple ingredient can now be attached to an arrow to become a powerful way to defeat enemies. The board on the ground over there can also become a flying carpet. A new game design using this system was born. Even if you aren't sure what to use these things for at first, you will come up with new ways to combine them to make something useful. Sticking two things together produces something new. We used this as a guide when preparing this presentation, which brings us to physics and sound. By combining two technical fields that aren't usually spoken about together, we thought that we might be able to create an interesting story. Today, I invite the lead programmers from each field to discuss this game from their perspectives. And so, I will pass the baton to the lead physics engineer, Takayama-san. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dohta-san. When I first saw the prototype, I was excited that this was going to be a great game. But I also knew this was going to be very, very difficult. I said to myself, are we really doing this? Development is going to be chaos. The more I thought, the more I worried. But in life, it's sometimes important to have the courage to push forward. As expected, the world fell apart. At this rate, the world will destroy itself before Ganondorf comes back. And so began our battle against the true menace of Hyrule. Hello everyone, I'm Takahiro Takayama. Since I began at Nintendo, I've worked on many games as a programmer. And now I developed the in-house physics library and tools. I was a physics programming lead on Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Thank you for having me today. Before we start, like Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom uses Havoc as the base for the physics engine. And on top of that, we have our in-house physics library, which is the foundation for the physics in Tears of the Kingdom. Please let me switch to Japanese now. さらなる掛け算の遊びで広がる世界を目指すために、私たちが取り組んだことは2つありました。
With the aim of expanding the world by enhancing the multiplicative gameplay, there were two things we attempted, and I'd like to touch on those.
1つ目は全てが物理で動く世界。
The first was to create an entirely physics-driven world.
2つ目はその上に構築された専用実装なしで事象が起きる仕組みです。
The second was to create a system where unique interactions occur without any dedicated implementation.
はじめに全てが物理で動く世界が必要になった話から紹介します。
I'll start out by explaining why we needed an entirely physics-driven world.
私たちが開発中に物理で動かすというときは、ダイナミックな合体とコンストレイントで構成されたオブジェクトに質量や完成モーメントを持たせて速度や加速度でコントロールすることを意味しています。
During development, when we say physics-driven, what we mean is objects have mass and moment of inertia, and they can be controlled using things like velocity and acceleration.
逆の非物理なオブジェクトとはどういうものでしょうか。
So what would the opposite be? What is a non-physics-driven object?
それは私たちはキネマティックな合体制御と呼んでいるものです。合体をアニメーションから計算される速度で無理やり動かします。
It's what we call a kinematic rigid body control. It's forcibly moving a rigid body at a velocity calculated from the animation.
実装が簡単で結果も分かりやすいので、Tears of the Kingdom の開発初期には私たちもよく使っていました。
The implementation is easy, and the results are also visually easy to understand. So we used it quite a bit in the early stages of development for Tears of the Kingdom.
しかし、気をつけなければいけないこととして、キネマティックに制御された合体は無限の質量を持ち、物理計算を破綻させます。この動画のように鉄が巻き込まれることは期待されることではありません。
However, rigid bodies controlled by kinematics have infinite mass and can break down a physics-based calculation. As seen in this footage, you normally wouldn't expect the metal object to get caught up like this.
実際、開発現場は大変なことになっていました。非物理なオブジェクトと先ほどのウルトラハンドの自由度の高さは日々各地で問題を引き起こしました。
Practically speaking, this meant chaos for us. The clash between these non-physics-driven objects and Ultrahand, with its high degree of freedom, caused daily problems all over the land of Hyrule. It went something like this.
壊れました。飛んでいきました。分かってる。後で直すから。まずはやりたい遊びを試して。と解決方法を探しました。
I would hear things like, it broke, or it went flying. And I would respond, I know, we'll deal with it later. Just focus on getting the gameplay in there and trying it out. We were in search of a solution.
解決の糸口になったのは、前作ブレス・オブ・ザ・ワイルドでの経験でした。これは先ほどの非物理な制御で破綻していた歯車ですが、
The key to that solution was in our experience developing Breath of the Wild. This is the cogwheel from earlier that was not functioning properly due to non-physics-driven controls.
位置が固定されている2つの歯車を
We connected the two fixed cogwheels
速度を伝えるためにコンストレイントでつなぎ、
with a constraint to transfer velocity
片方をモーターで動かすように変更しました。
and moved one of them with a motor.
すべての計算が物理のルールで行われるので破綻はなくなりました。この経験から世界が非物理に動かしているものをなくしてすべてを物理で動かすことが問題の解決につながると考えました。
Because all calculations are now physics-based, all the issues we were facing were now resolved. From this experience, we realized removing all non-physics-driven objects and making everything physics-driven would lead us to the solution we were looking for.
Tears of the Kingdom で初めに実装されていたシャッターは非物理で動かされていて、ウルトラハンドで破綻を引き起こすものの一つでした。
In Tears of the Kingdom, gates were initially implemented as non-physics-driven objects, and thus were one of many objects that proved problematic when using Ultra Hand.
当時の実装では、プレイヤーがシャッターの下に何かを置くことで、物理計算を破綻させることができました。シャッターがキネマティックな制御をされていたからです。
If the player were to place something underneath the gate, the physics calculation would fall apart because this was a kinematic-controlled gate.
破綻を防ぐためにシャッターを物理で動かすように変更しました。
So to address this, we made the gate physics-driven.
地面とスライダーコンストレイントでつながる扉を
This is now controlled by connecting the ground and the gate with a slider constraint.
モーターで力を与えることで制御します。
We then add a motor to power it.
物理のルールで計算されることで破綻はなくなりました。
This removed all the breakdown.
そして非物理を物理にするという実装は私たちにさらなる発見をもたらしました。
But this shift from non-physics-driven to physics-driven brought many new discoveries for us.
これはとある祠の氷を小さくすることでスイッチが押せるようになるよというネタです。
This particular shrine is one where you can weigh a switch down by reducing the size of a block of ice.
世界の破綻を防ぐために物理で動くシャッターに変更した結果、シャッターを閉じないという別の解決を生み出しました。
When we changed the gate to be physics-driven to prevent the world from destroying itself, it also resulted in an alternate solution to the shrine, simply keeping the gate open.
これこそがまさに私たちが求めている掛け算の遊びの一つの形であり、すべてのオブジェクトを物理で作ることの正しさを確認できました。
This is precisely the kind of multiplicative gameplay we were seeking, and a confirmation that making everything physics-driven was the correct approach.
また、物理で動かすべきなのはオブジェクトだけの話ではありません。モドレコなどのプレイヤーの能力も同様です。
And this wasn't just limited to objects. Player abilities like recall also needed to be physics-driven.
非物理な制御の方が手応えを見るためには早いのですが、この動画のような破綻を起こすことがあります。
While implementation is faster using a non-physics-driven control for a quick gut check, it can also lead to something like this.
最終的には他のあらゆるものと同様、モドレコも物理で動く実装に切り替えました。
In the end, like everything else, we also changed recall to be physics-driven.
その結果、このようにプレイヤーがどのような操作をしても世界が壊れることはなくなりました。
As a result, regardless of what the player does, we have a world free from self-destruction, as seen here. こ
こまでで今作のような高い自由度のある世界では全てが物理で動く必要があるということを説明しました。
Up until this point, I've spoken about how a world with a high degree of freedom requires everything to be physics-driven.
例外なく全てのものをダイナミックな構態とコンソネントで構築します。
Every single thing, without exception, is built with dynamic, rigid bodies and constraints.
これによってプレイヤーの自由な発想を破綻なく実行できる世界を作ることができました。
And this is what allowed us to create a world in which players can freely translate their creativity and imagination into action without destroying the world.
続いて掛け算の遊びを実現するために必要だったもう一つの要素である専用実装なしで事象が起きる仕組みについて紹介したいと思います。
Next, I'd like to introduce the other important element necessary to bring this idea of enhanced multiplicative gameplay to life, a system that allows unique interactions to occur without dedicated implementation.
さらなる掛け算の遊びが目指す世界はプレイヤーの自由な発想次第でさまざまな事象が起きる世界です。
Enhanced multiplicative gameplay aims to create a world in which a multitude of unique interactions can happen based on a player's creativity and imagination.
特別な実装なしでもそれぞれの事象が実現できる仕組みが良い仕組みだと考えました。
And so we thought a system that allows for unique interactions to occur without any dedicated implementation is what we needed.
ここでいう専用実装とは実現したい一つ一つの事象に対して専用のプログラムを実装することです。
Dedicated implementation here refers to having a dedicated program for each and every interaction we wanted to include.
例えば私たちはプレイヤーが車を作って冒険できる世界を目指していましたが車のプログラムのようなものは実装していません。
For example, we wanted the player to be able to build vehicles to explore, but we didn't implement any sort of dedicated vehicle program.
あくまでもそれぞれの要素、タイヤ、操縦桿、木の板を実装し、プレイヤーがそれらを組み合わせて自由に車を実現できるようになっています。
All we did was implement the individual elements, like wheels, a steering stick, and a wooden board, so the player can combine them to create a vehicle themselves.
また、この扉も専用のプログラムは実装していません。タイヤ、石の板、鎖の組み合わせで実現されています。
The same goes for this gate. There was no dedicated programming. This is just a combination of wheels, a stone slab, and chains.
タイヤが鎖を巻き上げて、タイヤの軸が固定されている扉が開くというメカニズムです。
The wheel is fixed onto the gate, which opens up as the wheel rolls up the chains.
パドルボートも同様です。タイヤ、木の板に浮力、抵抗などの水のインタラクションが加わることでこの事象が生み出されています。
Paddle boats are yet another example. Buoyancy and resistance acting on the paddle boat's individual elements like the wheels and wooden boards result in this unique interaction.
ここまでは事象について紹介してきましたが、ここからは部品の紹介をしていきます。
So far, I've touched on the interactions themselves, but I'd like to now talk about the various parts or components that trigger these interactions.
タイヤはホイール、モーター、シャフトの3つの合体で構成されていて、
Take the wheel. It's comprised of 3 rigid bodies, the wheel, motor, and shaft.
シャフトはホイールに直接つながるのではなく、モーターを支えています。
Instead of the shaft connecting directly with the wheel, it holds up the motor.
モーターからのトルクがホイールに伝わり、実際に合体が回転することで地面との摩擦により推進力を得ています。
The torque from the motor transfers to the wheel's rigid body, causing it to rotate, and the friction between the ground and the wheel creates the driving force.
鎖は物を引っ張ったり、動く力の方向を変えたりするために使われます。
Chains are used to pull an object or change the direction of a moving force.
長さに応じて数の異なる複数のカプセル合体をボールソケットコンソネントで連結するという物理構成になっています。
It's a series of capsule-shaped rigid bodies that vary in number based on length and are connected via ball socket constraints.
今作では水の抵抗の表現として速度方向への投影面積を使った抵抗の計算を採用しました。
In order to simulate water resistance when an object enters the water, we use the projected area of the direction of velocity to calculate the resistance.
水の抵抗を表現する簡単な方法では、全方向での単純な減衰も考えられますが、イカダやボートがより納得感のある動きになるためには、面積に応じた速度の違いが重要でした。
An easier way to simulate water resistance would be to simply apply velocity decay in all directions. But in order for rafts and boats to have a more convincing feel and movement to them, we needed changes in velocity based on the contact surface.
私たちが用意した掛け算の遊びの部品は、オブジェクトやゾナウギアに限りません。
The components of multiplicative gameplay were not limited to just objects and zonai devices.
ここで紹介した水の抵抗計算は、すべてのオブジェクトに平等に適用され、これによってパドルボートという事象を実現できています。
The calculations pertaining to water are applied equally to all objects, allowing us to create this unique interaction, also known as a paddle boat.
特別な実装なしでもそれぞれの事象が実現できる仕組みが良い仕組みだと考えて、事象を起こす部品を多く実装しました。
Since our goal was to create a system where unique interactions occur without dedicated implementation, we included many different components that can trigger these interactions.
私たちが思いもしなかった組み合わせで、プレイヤーたちが冒険している様子をたくさん見ることができて、とても嬉しいです。
And we've been so happy to see so many players combining these components in ways we hadn't thought about as they embark on their adventures.
コログたちも喜んでいますね。
It looks like the Koroks are happy about it too.
ここまでで、さらなる掛け算の遊びで広がる世界を目指すために、私たちが取り組んだこととして、すべてが物理で動く世界と専用実装なしで事象が起きる仕組みを紹介しました。
I've shared the two concepts crucial in our efforts to create a world that expands through enhanced multiplicative gameplay, an entirely physics-driven world in a system where unique interactions occur without dedicated implementation.
これだけで十分でしょうか？いえ、実はこれらだけではまだまだ不十分です。本当に必要なこととして。
But is that enough? The answer is no, not at all. There's one more vital piece of the puzzle missing.
チーム全体で取り組むことが必要でした。
That piece is working together as a team.
チームメンバーの一人一人が実現したい遊びを理解して、そのために何をすべきかを理解して制作を進めました。ここからはチーム内の取り組みについてダイジェストで紹介していきます。
Development consisted of each member of the team understanding the gameplay they wanted to realize and understanding what they needed to do to achieve it. I'd like to now share some of the team's efforts.
まず、すべてが物理で動く世界を作るために、アーティストやゲームデザイナーと物理パラメータを正しく設定しました。
First, in order to create an entirely physics-driven world, we worked with the artists and designers to set up the physics parameters correctly.
木、鉄、石など何でできているかの素材を指定すると、そのオブジェクトの密度が決まり、質量や完成モーメントが自動的に計算されます。計算に必要な体積はシェイプの形状から自動的に計算されます。
When we assign a material property to an object, such as wood, metal, stone, and so on, that object's mass and moment of inertia are automatically calculated. The volume necessary for that calculation is in turn automatically calculated based on the object's shape.
自動計算ではうまくいかないケースがあって、その時はアーティストやゲームデザイナーと連携をとって正しく補正します。
But there are times when an automatic calculation doesn't fit our needs, and in those cases we work with the artists and game designers to make adjustments.
例えば、Tears of the Kingdom の板は現実の板に比べて厚く作られています。ゲームの中での視認性や操作性など、さまざまな理由から決まった形状です。
For example, objects like boards, slabs, and plates in Tears of the Kingdom are actually thicker than those in the real world, due to various reasons like the need to make them easier to see or control.
このような場合は、シェイプの厚さ通りに自動計算してしまうと重くなりすぎてしまうので、イメージに合う質量や完成モーメントに補正しました。
If the mass for these objects were to be calculated based on the shape as is, they would become way too heavy, so we corrected the mass and moment of inertia to match what the player would expect them to be.
祠のギミックは全てが物理で動くため、設計が厳密なものが多いです。一つ一つの部品が正しく動いているかをいつでも確認できるように、全てのギミックを集めた検証場を作りました。
Because all the puzzle elements for the shrines are physics-driven, many of them required precise construction. We created sort of a testing room so that we can check to make sure each and every one of them were functioning properly at any given time.
2馬車のような複雑なものもエンジニアとアーティストの間で綿密なコミュニケーションで作られました。車輪の大きさや位置は物理的な挙動から調整され、それに合わせた一番良い見た目をアーティストが作りました。
Complex objects such as wagons were created through close and careful communication between engineers and artists. The size and position of the wheels were adjusted based on their physics behavior, and the artists created the best possible look for them.
これはタイヤを乗り物の駆動力以外で使うネタです。
This is an example of using wheels for purposes other than driving a vehicle.
ゲームデザイナーが祠のゲームデザインをするとき、掛け算の遊びを楽しめるようなネタを作ります。
When a game designer is working on a shrine, they create content that maximizes multiplicative gameplay and fun.
これは板の向きを変えることが正解になっているネタです。
In this shrine, the key lies in changing the orientation of the board.
先ほど説明した水の抵抗計算を速度の投影面積を使うようにしたことで生まれました。
This idea came up when we used the projected area of the direction of velocity in calculating the water resistance.
水との直感的なインタラクションを使う私の好きなネタです。
I personally like this idea very much as it leverages an intuitive interaction with the water.
事象を起こす部品としてのタイヤもゲームデザイン、アートの観点、物理のコラボレーションからできています。
Even the wheel, as a component to trigger unique interactions, is a result of the collaboration between game design, artistic perspective, and physics.
組み合わせて作られた車を運転する楽しさを重視していたので、サスペンションがついたとき、みんなとても良い手応えを感じました。
Because we were focused on making sure the experience of driving assembled vehicles felt right and enjoyable, I vividly remember the team's excitement about how good the driving felt once the suspension was attached.
アーティストがサスペンションを内蔵したタイヤをデザインしましたが、世の中であまり見たことがないものなので大変だったそうです。
The artist in charge designed a wheel with built-in suspension, which she mentioned was quite challenging, given it's not something you really see out in the real world.
シャフトがモーターをサスペンションによって支えていて、モーターがホイールに駆動力を与えるという物理構成になっています。
The shaft holds up the motor via the suspension, and the motor provides driving power to the wheel.
モーターから先が上下左右に動くことで、タイヤが設置する時間を増やします。
The length of time the wheel makes contact with the ground is increased by having the wheels, along with the motor, shift up and down and left to right.
また、レンジリミットとプレーンの2つのコンストレイントによって稼働範囲をコントロールしています。
There's also a range limit constraint and a plane constraint to control the range of movement.
最後に携帯鍋を紹介します。
Lastly, I'd like to talk about the portable pot.
鍋を自由な場所に置けるようになったので、鍋が平らなところに置かれるとは限りません。このままでは煮込み料理がこぼれてしまいます。
Since they can be placed anywhere now, there's no guarantee the pot will be placed on a flat, level surface, meaning your dish could spill out.
煮込み料理がこぼれない対策として、アーティストから伸ばせる足をつけようという提案がありました。
As a countermeasure to this critical problem, an artist proposed adding telescopic legs to the pot.
最終的には物理の安定性の観点からポットの底にジョイントを入れることにしました。これで無事に煮込み料理がこぼれなくなって嬉しいです。
But in the end, we decided to put a joint at the bottom of the pot for stability. I'm happy to say your soup is now safe.
さらにとてもありがたいことに、この携帯鍋のジョイントはプレイヤーさんたちの自由な発想により 別の使い方でも役に立っています。
And furthermore, we were so happy to see that the joint on the portable pot has seen a whole range of other uses, thanks to the creative imagination of so many players.
チーム全体での取り組みについて紹介しました。Tears of the Kingdom の広大な世界を破綻なく作り切るためには、その実現したい世界をよく理解しているゲームデザイナー、アーティストとの連携が必要でした。
As you can see from the examples I've shared, in order to bring the vast world of Tears of the Kingdom to life without it falling apart, it was essential that we worked intimately with designers and artists that had a deep understanding of the world we wanted to create.
これで物理からの説明を終わります。続いてサウンドの長田さんに代わります。ありがとうございました。
This concludes the physics portion of the presentation. I'll now pass it along to Osada-san to talk about the sound. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Takayama-san. But aren't you forgetting something? You forgot the sound team. There. That's better. Hello, everyone. My name is Junya Osada. For several years after I joined the company, I was the sound designer in charge of creating sound effects. Starting with the development of Breath of the Wild, I became the programming lead, and I developed the in-house sound library and tools. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm going to switch to Japanese now. さて、冒頭にあったように、ブレス・オブ・ザ・ワイルドの広大でシームレスなフィールドは、Tears of the Kingdom においてさらなる広がりを見せてくれました。ただ空間が広くなっただけではなく、さまざまなものを組み合わせるという遊びの自由度も広がっています。
Now then, you've seen how the vast and seamless world of Breath of the Wild was further expanded for Tears of the Kingdom, but this wasn't just limited to physical space. With the ability to combine various objects, the freedom within the gameplay itself also expanded.
それにより、さまざまな空間がゲームに登場するようになりました。開けた場所や入り組んだ地形、閉じた空間など、広大なハイラルのどんな場所でも音の広がりや自然な響きを表現したいところです。
Because of this, many different kinds of spaces now appear within the game. We wanted to depict how sound spreads and naturally echoes in every corner of this expanded Hyrule, whether in open-air places, complicated terrain, enclosed spaces, and so on.
そのためには、サウンド設計の軸となるような何らかのルールが必要そうでした。
To do this, it seemed we would need some rules that could act as the focal point of our sound design.
そこで現実世界の音響特性がそのルールになるのではないかと考え、3D 空間で音を鳴らすという基本に立ち返ってみることにしました。
We thought perhaps that real-world acoustic characteristics could be those rules, and so we decided to go back to the basics of what it means to make sound in a 3D space.
その前に、ゼルダの伝説ではさまざまなインタラクティブミュージックに取り組んできたことをご存知でしょうか。
But before we get into that, did you know that we've worked on various types of interactive music in the Legend of Zelda series?
ほんの一部になりますが、過去作での事例を紹介します。
Here are just a few examples from past games.
少し懐かしい気分になりますね。
Pretty nostalgic, right?
そして時代が変わり、オーケストラ収録が多くなった今でも、やはりインタラクティブな音楽表現に力を注いできました。
Times have changed, but even now, in an era when orchestrated recordings are more prominent, we pour our energy into interactive musical expression.
ゲームの規模が大きくなり、遊びの自由度が高くなっていくにつれて、より複雑な音楽表現も求められるようになっていきました。
As games grew larger in scale and freer in gameplay, so grew the demand for an even more complex musical expression.
そういった要求に応えるため、こんなツールを開発しました。
We developed this tool in order to meet those demands.
ノードを接続していくことで、楽曲の遷移の仕方をグラフィカルに編集できるようになっています。インタラクティブな音楽の設計を作曲と並行して行っていくためには欠かせないツールと言えます。
Now we can graphically edit the way music transitions by connecting nodes. You could say that this is an indispensable tool for designing interactive music as it's being composed.
そういえば先ほどの動画に楽団員が映っていました。この楽団員は演奏とアニメが同期していることに注目しがちですが、もう一つ SE と同じようにゲーム空間で鳴っているという特徴があります。
Speaking of which, we got to see the musical troupe in one of the earlier videos. We tend to notice that their performances and animations are synchronized, but another distinctive factor is that their music actually plays in the game space in the same way sound effects do.
もしインタラクティブミュージックのような大胆な音の変化を効果音でも表現するとしたらどうでしょうか。これがただ波形をそのまま鳴らすのではなく、3D のゲーム空間内で音が自然な鳴り方になるように波形をコントロールするということです。
What if we were to express some of the bold changes, much like the interactive music we spoke about, but in sound effects? This means rather than just playing an audio file as is, manipulating it so that the sound plays naturally within a 3D game space.
そもそも 3D 空間で音を鳴らすということは、音源が遠くに離れれば音が小さく聞こえたり、音源が画面の右側にあれば右のスピーカーから聞こえたり、洞窟に入れば音が響いたりといった音の変化をゲーム内で再現することと言えます。
We can define making sounds in a 3D space to mean reproducing changes in sounds within the game, such as how sounds coming from far away sound quieter, sounds coming from the right side of the screen can be heard from the right speaker, and sounds echo when the player enters a cave.
音が遠ざかることを表現するのは、距離を横軸にとった音量の距離減衰カーブを用いるのが一般的ですが、単に音量を下げればいいというわけではありません。
It is common to depict sounds moving farther away by using a distance attenuation curve for volume, with distance taken on the horizontal axis. But that doesn't mean just lowering the volume is enough.
単に音量を下げるだけでなく、フィルターをかけて音をこもらせたり、少しリバーブをかけて環境音などの周囲の音になじませたりすることで、よりリアルに音が遠ざかったように感じさせることができます。
Not only do we lower the volume, but we also apply filters that muffle the sound and reverb to blend it with the ambient sounds of the environment. In doing so, we can make it feel like the sound is realistically moving farther away.
パラメータで調整せずに、近距離の音と遠距離の音をそれぞれ用意して、距離に応じてクロスフェードさせるのもいいですね。
Rather than adjusting the parameters, another method that works well is preparing both short and long-distance sounds and crossfading them according to distance.
それらの手法はよく知られていて、従来のタイトルでも用いられてきました。
These methods are well known and have been used on many existing titles. しかし、さまざまな空間が登場するハイラルでは、単に音が変化するだけでは物足りません。ゲーム内で音が鳴ったとき、どの方向にどれくらい離れているのか、洞窟なのか森の中なのかなど、音を聞くだけでも分かるようになっていてほしいです。 However, there are many different kinds of spaces in Hyrule, so simply changing the sounds isn't enough. We want players to be able to tell which direction a sound is coming from, how far away it is, whether it's inside a cave or a forest, and so on, just by hearing it.
そのために、やはりすべての音が同じルールで制御されている必要があります。
To do this, all sounds really must be controlled by the same rules.
例えば、距離が2倍になるごとに音量が半分になるという性質がよく知られています。これは低音源において単位面積あたりの音圧が距離によって減衰していくことを示していて、計算によって求めることができます。
For example, it is a well-known property of sound that when distance is doubled, volume is halved. This represents the fact that, in point sources, sound pressure per unit area attenuates with distance and can be determined with a calculation.
これはシンプルに言えば、大きい音は遠くまで聞こえて、小さい音は遠くまで聞こえないということです。
Put in simple terms, this means that loud sounds can be heard at a distance, while quiet sounds cannot.
つまり遠くまで音を聞かせたいならば、その音は大きな音である必要があります。
In other words, if you want a sound to be heard from far away, then it needs to be loud.
距離が倍になるにつれて音量が半分になる変化を対数グラフで表せば、このようにシンプルなグラフで表すことができます。
A simple logarithmic graph like this shows the change in volume decreasing by half as distance doubles.
しかしこれだけで良いでしょうか。例えば鶏の鳴き声は100デシベル程度と言われていますが、この音が減衰しきるには10万メートルかかるようです。マイルに換算すれば約62マイルです。
But is that all it takes? For example, a rooster's crow is reportedly about 100 decibels. It would appear to take 100,000 meters before its sound would attenuate. Converted to miles, that's about 62 miles.
日本で言えば東京から富士山くらいが約62マイルです。鶏は確かにうるさいですが、サクラメントで鳴いた鶏の鳴き声がこの会場まで届くとは考えにくいです。
In Japan, the distance from Tokyo to Mount Fuji is about 62 miles. While roosters certainly are loud, I have a hard time believing a rooster crowing in Sacramento could be heard from this stage.
つまり音のエネルギーの拡散の現象だけでは直接音の減衰を表現するのは難しいということです。
Basically, it's very difficult to represent direct sound attenuation using only the phenomenon of sound diffusion.
そこで過剰減衰、ここでは特に空気による吸収を考慮することにします。
This is where excess attenuation, or in this case, air absorption in particular, comes into play.
空気吸収では広域ほど減衰しやすいという特性が実験によっても知られています。
With air absorption, experiments have shown that the higher the frequency, the stronger the attenuation.
空気吸収は距離に比例して減衰するため、対数グラフ上だと曲線になります。これで鶏の聞こえる範囲も現実的な距離になりました。
Since air absorption decays in proportion to distance, it becomes a curve on a logarithmic graph. With this, the audible range for a rooster's crow becomes a much more realistic distance.
また、広域ほど減衰しやすいという特性をフィルターを使って表現します。どのような特性のフィルターをどれくらいの距離からかけるべきかといったことも、過剰減衰を考慮して適切なバランスで調整されるようにしました。
Here too, we use filters to depict stronger attenuation for higher frequencies. We take excess attenuation into account and make adjustments to find the right balance for things like what characteristics we need filters for and the distance at which those filters should be applied.
そのようにして設計された音がこちらです。矢が着弾するときの音の表情の変化が感じられますでしょうか。
Here are some examples of sounds that have been designed in such a way. Can you sense the change in the way the arrow sounds when it impacts?
車の走行音は距離が遠ざかるにつれて周囲の環境音に溶け込んでいくように聞こえたでしょうか。
Did you hear the way the sound of the vehicle blends into the environment as it gets farther away?
ゲーム空間内の音の鳴り方を表現するには、距離だけではなく間接音表現も重要です。音の反射の仕方や残響の長さを適切に設定することで、家の中なのか岩の洞窟なのかといったその空間の特徴を音で表現することができます。
When depicting sounds within a game space, it's important to factor in not just distance, but also indirect sound. Whether it's the inside of a house or within a rock cave, you can represent the characteristics of that space with sound by correctly setting how the sounds reverberate or how long their echoes last.
従来のゼルダシリーズでもリバーブエフェクトを用いて表現してきましたが、調整すべきパラメータが多く対応が大変でした。
We've used reverb effects on other Zelda games in the past as well, but there were too many parameters to adjust, and it ended up being a lot of work to address.
そこで自動的にリバーブパラメータを算出するようにしました。周囲の壁の方向や距離から部屋の容積を、壁の材質から吸音率などの情報を収集し、アイリングの残響公式を用いて減衰時間などのパラメータを算出します。
So, we made it so the reverb parameters would be automatically calculated. Information such as room capacity based on the direction and distance of nearby walls, and sound absorption rate based on the material of the walls, is collected and used to calculate parameters using a formula called Eyring's reverberation time equation.
残響公式に基づいて作られた空間の響きをご確認ください。
This is what echoes sound like when based on the reverberation equation. さらに今作では洞窟をはじめとして入り組んだ地形が非常に増えています。ハイラル世界の音をより現実に近づけて表現するためには、音の遮蔽や音の回り込みも重要になってきます。Taking it a step further, this game has a much larger amount of complicated terrain such as caves. Sound obstruction and occlusion are also important when creating even more realistic sounds for Hyrule.
本作では立体的な世界を表現するため、地形のボクセル情報を持っています。
In this game, in order to depict a three-dimensional world, the terrain contains voxel information.
ボクセルごとにその座標が室内かどうか、水面が近いかどうかといった地形の情報が格納されています。
Each voxel stores terrain information, such as whether its coordinates are located indoors or whether they are near the water's surface.
また、通れルーフ可能かどうかのようなレベルデザインに重要な情報も格納されています。
They also contain information vital to level design, such as whether it's possible to use ascend.
サウンドでもこのボクセルを利用し、A スターアルゴリズムによる音の経路探索を行っていました。
Sound uses these voxels too to search for sound paths using an informed search algorithm.
少し補足になりますが、今作のサウンドリスナーはカメラの位置で計算を行っているのですが、音の経路探索では音源からリンクの位置に向かって経路を探索しています。
To give a bit of extra information, in this game, the sound system performs calculations for the audio listener based on the camera's position, but searches for sound paths between the sound source and link's position.
これによって音が壁の向こうに行けば変化しますし、
This is why sound changes when you go behind a wall like this.
音の経路がドアによって動的に変化する場合にも対応しています。
This also addresses cases when the sound path is changed dynamically by a door. このようにゲーム世界の自由度がより高く、そして広大になっていくとともに、さまざまな音が世界を彩っていくようになります。As you can see, expanding the degree of freedom and the world itself paints the world with a diverse palette of sound.
ここで重要なことは、それらの音が同じルールでなっていることです。そしてそのルールにおいて特に重要なことは音の大きさです。
The important thing here is that all sounds follow the same rules, and among those rules, loudness is particularly important.
つまり、どれくらいの大きさの音であれば、どれくらいの距離まで聞こえるのかといった音の大きさに基づいた音響特性を作っておけば、あとは各音に音の大きさを割り当てるだけで、ゲーム空間内で適切な聞こえ方を得ることができます。
Basically, if you create acoustic characteristics based on the loudness of a sound, such as how loud it is and how far it can be heard, all that's left is to assign a loudness to each sound, and you'll be able to hear them within the game space properly.
ハートの器のような小さい音や積乱雲のような大きな音がハイラルではこんな聞こえ方をするようになりました。
This is how sounds can now be heard in Hyrule, from quiet sounds like the heart container to loud sounds like the storm cloud.
「 さらに効果音ではない楽器の音も周囲の壁によって響いたり、崖の下で鳴っているように聞こえるようになりました。
And what's more, instrumental music that isn't a sound effect can also sound as if it's echoing off of nearby walls or coming from the bottom of a cliff.
一つ一つの音がゲーム空間内で自然になるようになりましたが、そういえばこの世界は自由度も非常に高いです。ウルトラハンドによって作られるさまざまなものに専用の波形を用意することはできません。
Each and every sound now plays naturally within the game space, but now that I mention it, there is an incredible amount of freedom in this world. It would not be possible to prepare dedicated audio files for all of the many different things that can be created with Ultra Hand.
先ほどの物理の話のように、サウンドでも専用実装なしで音が鳴る仕組みを考えました。
And so, like with physics, the sound team also thought of a system where sounds would play without dedicated implementation.
例えば荷馬車を見てみてください。車輪の転がる音や荷台の小刻みな揺れやきしみ、荷台をつなぐ鎖などの音が複合的になっているだけで、荷馬車を収録した音は使われていません。
Take a look at this wagon, for example. This is just a combination of the sound of wheels rolling, the short repeated shaking of the wooden bed, the chains connected to the bed, and so on. We did not use any recordings of actual wagon sounds.
パドルボートでもタイヤの回転による水の音や木の板が水の抵抗を受けながら水から出入りする音が組み合わさってなっています。
Even this paddle boat sound is a combination of the sound the water makes when wheels rotate through it, and the sound of wooden boards fighting water resistance as they splash through the water.
これは物理システムによって制御された合体の動き方を解析し、その大きさや材質によって音を鳴らし分けているという仕組みなんです。
We made a system that analyzes the way rigid bodies controlled by the physics system will move, then bases the sound on their size and material.
これによってさまざまな音が専用のプログラムを組まなくても鳴らせるようになりました。
As a result, various sounds will now play without needing to have a dedicated program set up to play them.
ブロックゴーレムの幾何学な動きや、
Whether it's the flux construct's geometric movements,
レールをフックで滑り落ちたり、
or sliding down a rail on a hook,
吊り橋も物理でつながっているだけで、吊り橋プログラムなんてそもそもありませんが、たわんだりきしんだりする音が自動的になるようになっています。
the suspension bridges are also held together just with physics, without any kind of special suspension bridge program at all, and their wobbling and creaking sounds play automatically.
もちろんこれらの音も先ほどの音の大きさのルールに基づいてゲーム空間内で自然な鳴り方にしています。
Of course, these sounds are also based on the sound loudness rules I explained earlier, and they play naturally within the game space.
これはいわばハイラル世界の音の鳴り方のルールが構築されたと言えるかもしれません。このシステムによって自分が作った覚えがないのに製品クオリティの音が鳴っているという驚きの声がサウンドデザイナーから上がっていましたし、
Having come up with this form of implementation makes it feel like we have, in a sense, built a rule system for how sounds are made in the world of Hyrule. Many of the sound designers were surprised at the high-quality sounds that were created with this system, sounds which they had no memory of creating.
ディレクターからは、これってつまり音の物理エンジンのようなものですねと言われたりもしました。
Even the director told us, "So this is basically a physics engine for sound, isn't it?"
初めからそんな仕組みを目指していたわけではありませんが、広大なハイラルでの音をより自然に表現しようとしたことで、結果的にこんな仕組みになったのだと思っています。私からは以上です。ありがとうございました。
We didn't start out with the goal of building such a system, but it was the result of our efforts to use sound to make the expanded Hyrule more dynamic. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Takayama-san, Osada-san. Physics and sound are two different fields, but I think they have some things in common when it comes to how they evolved in this game. First, both steer towards a more rules-based system design to allow for greater player freedom. And these designs added another layer of complexity to interactions that occur within the game. And as a result, they each created a system that brings new discoveries not only to players, but also us developers. As I explained at the beginning, the concept for multiplicative gameplay was, rather than creating something fun, create a system that makes fun things happen. With Tears of the Kingdom, we aimed to achieve an even higher level of freedom. As a result, rather than determining each object's movement, the physics team focused on creating a system that makes objects move. And rather than creating every sound you heard in the game, the sound team created a system that makes it sound that way. The fact that they focused on and worked hard to tune this system is fascinating to me. Rather than creating unique interactions, create a system that causes unique interactions to occur. I believe this was the essence of the evolution of physics and sound in Tears of the Kingdom. That's all for our presentation. Thank you for your kind attention. And the interpreters you have heard today are from Nintendo of America. Let's have a big round of applause for them, too.